Welcome back to the book log, everybody. Today I'm talking about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. I'm trying to be as fair as possible to this book, given that its intended audience is children and not necessarily people who like to review books for fun. But at the same time, it's one of the most famous stories ever, and I was curious how the source material holds up, how it compares to the incredibly famous movie, and how it stands up to its almost unequal position as a ubiquitous cultural artifact. It almost feels silly to even review this book. It's like reviewing the Bible or something. Everyone already has a personal understanding of what this story is, and yet probably not a lot of people have actually read the thing. Broadly speaking, everyone's conception of what this story is, probably primarily based on the movie, is pretty much exactly correct. It follows a young Dorothy along with her dog Toto, who is swept away by a tornado from Kansas to the magical land of Oz, and in order to return home, she needs to travel to the Emerald City to seek help from the wizard who lives there. Along the way, she meets the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, and the Cowardly Lion, who each have their own desires, brains, heart, courage, respectively. They face various challenges along the yellow brick road, such as the Wicked Witch of the West, and they ultimately learn that the qualities they seek already lie within themselves. Everybody already knows about all that, so I'm just going to mention some things that I thought were noteworthy relating to the book specifically that maybe not a lot of people know about, or maybe that weren't included in the movie adaptations. To start, just to get this out of the way, again, you can tell this is a children's book. Obviously, this means the language and prose are very plain, very easy to understand, but to me, the most noticeable thing was the pacing, which was really weird. This book is extremely linear and episodic, and within each small chapter, there is some specific focus that tends to begin and end very quickly. Things that I thought were going to be much larger components to the story would, in the book, be incredibly brief. For instance, the group encountering and subsequently defeating the Wicked Witch of the West all happened in 2 pages. Entire characters and settings and subplots would be introduced and abandoned in such quick fashion it was almost difficult to keep track of sometimes. I'm not sure if this phenomenon is common throughout a lot of children's books or if it's specific to this one, but the pacing felt very strange and kind of distracting to me. The book almost reads more like a outline of a novel as opposed to an actual novel. So now that I have my critique of this story written for kids out of the way, I think there are some things about this book that are genuinely interesting and cool. It's very fantastical, dreamlike, colorful. It's easy to imagine everything visually. The movie is very famous for the first section being in black and white until Dorothy arrives in Oz, and then the rest of the movie plays out in color. The book actually does pretty much the same thing. In the first chapter, which takes place in Kansas, everything is described as dull and gray and colorless from the ground to the sky to Aunt Em and Uncle Henry themselves. But as soon as Dorothy arrives in Oz, the color of every single thing is described in meticulous detail, from the flowers to the grass to the buildings to the clothes the inhabitants of Oz are wearing. The slippers are silver, though. This focus on color is, strangely enough, a very strong commonality between the book and the movie. But there are quite a few differences, and many things present in the book that I had simply never even heard of before. The book gets into some of the lore around the 4 witches, the flying monkeys, the history of Oz. There are also quite a few interesting episodes that most people probably don't know about. Near the end of the book, the gang travels through this village made entirely of porcelain china, including the habitants. At one point, they have to fight off these weird creatures called kalidas, which have the bodies of bears and the heads of tigers. There's a chapter where the Cowardly Lion falls asleep in a poppy field, and the gang needs to conscribe the help of an army of field mice and their queen to help drag him out. This book would almost have been better suited to be a TV show, just based on how many discrete events take place. Another difference that I thought was really cool were the different forms the Wizard of Oz took while presenting himself to the 4 characters individually. To Dorothy, he was a giant, disembodied, floating head like in the movie, but for the Scarecrow, he presented himself as a beautiful lady. To the Tin Woodman, he presented himself as this terrifying giant creature with the head of a rhinoceros and 5 eyes and 5 arms and 5 legs. And to the Cowardly Lion, he presented himself as literally just an enormous ball of fire. I thought the whole scene was so weird and interesting, almost psychedelic in a way. It reminded me of a scene out of Revelation or something. And speaking of things that are darker than what you would expect to see in a children's book, the story is surprisingly violent and grim and scary at points. For one, there's just a lot of death all throughout the whole book, and a lot of the group's solutions to problems just involve killing something. Both a cat and a giant spider get their heads chopped off. Granted, they were both antagonists in the story, but it was funny for the book to be like, and then they were killed by decapitation. The Tin Woodman kills all the Kalidas I mentioned earlier by chopping a wooden bridge they were crossing, leading them to fall to their deaths. And both evil witches are killed in pretty merciless, offhanded ways. And speaking of the Tin Woodman, he also has a pretty intense backstory. Like, the reason he's made of tin in the first place is because he kept accidentally, one by one, chopping off his limbs, head, and torso with his axe. There are a few other unsettling components, like the fact that neither the Scarecrow nor the Tin Woodman are capable of sleeping, so they just stand there awake in silence throughout the night. Something which is never played off as creepy, but is nonetheless creepy to me. Also, the whole facade of the Emerald City, how like nothing is truly green, but every visitor is forced to wear green tinted glasses that are chained to their head with a lock and key to maintain the illusion, is just like a bit dark. All in all, I thought this book was really interesting, maybe not so much from an entertainment perspective, but definitely from an anthropological perspective. I never would have read this book if not for the fact that it's such an immensely popular cultural touchstone, and I thought it was a worthwhile experience overall. It's filled with a lot of genuinely cool ideas and concepts. There are some interesting characters. It's got a nice digestible message. I've already belabored the point, but given that this is a book written for children, I am willing to meet it on its own ground and say that it's pretty good. Probably not something I will be returning to a lot during my free time, but I'm glad I got around to reading it. I'll give it like a 6.5.